All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ben Bussey, Director of Product here at Urban Footprint. I'm joined today by my colleague, Stephen Kennedy, Product Design Lead. We thank you very much for taking the time to join us this morning. We're very excited to kick off today's discussion, Art of the Map, How to Craft Beautiful Maps in Minutes. So in terms of agenda, before we get started, let me cover what we're going to talk about today. First, a little bit of context. We'll share a brief overview of who we are and what we do here at Urban Footprint. Then we'll dive into the heart of today's topic, and we'll get into why great cartography is an essential part of effective communication, and for many of you on the webinar today, a key part of the urban planning process. Next, we'll unpack how to elevate your map-making skills with a comprehensive review of design best practices. We'll also share how to make beautiful maps in Urban Footprint with a live demo session, which will be really exciting. Finally, we'll host a live Q&A session, so this will be interactive. I should mention that we have Andy Federer, VP of Marketing, and Jason Hercules, Customer Success Manager, standing by today to monitor and answer questions in the Q&A chat box. So we'd love for you to ask questions on chat. It's an interactive session, so please don't hesitate to get on there and ask questions as we go through the webinar today. So before I hand things over to Stephen, let me briefly introduce Urban Footprint. Urban Footprint is a mission-driven company designed to help planners, cities, and policymakers map, measure, and analyze the impacts of important urban planning and mobility decisions. Our software is built to support more sustainable, equitable, and resilient communities with easy access to essential planning, mobility, and policy data. Our software is designed to do things like map land use patterns and existing conditions anywhere in the United States, quickly represent future alternatives and get feedback from your project stakeholders, and also do things like map the impacts and the benefits across many different metrics, including things like emissions, transit accessibility, household costs, energy use, and a whole lot more. And so with that, I'll hand things over to Stephen, who will walk us through the elements of great map design. Over to you, Stephen.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. So before we examine the elements of great cartography, we have to ask ourselves, why do we make maps in the first place? I love to share this particular example by writer and cartographer Dennis Wood, who created a book of maps for one neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, including this one called the Squirrel Highway. Dennis writes that to the everyday observer, the networked canopy of trees, telephone poles, and electric wires that form a canopy over a neighborhood remains out of sight and out of mind. But when represented as a system of highways for squirrels, suddenly a totally new dimension of the built environment is revealed. So when we're making maps, you're creating a representation of the world as it exists now or could exist to communicate that vision to someone else. You're offering a perspective that normally may not be apparent just from looking around. Great maps can become a way to facilitate a conversation, gather reactions, and come to a shared understanding about complex topics. While the outcomes of planning often involve alterations of the physical world, much of the planning process is about understanding the less visible elements of a city and its systems. In practical terms, effective map making is about clear communication of these dimensions of the built environment to a variety of audiences, from clients and project stakeholders to citizens in public engagement processes. Effective exhibits facilitate informed and collaborative planning. As many of you on the webinar are planners, I'll focus specifically on this particular use case of Urban Footprint. Each stage of the planning process is typically supported with a wide array of exhibits, from existing conditions like we see here on the left, representing the physical attributes of the built environment, such as parks, circulation, and transportation networks, to site plans like we see here in the middle, representing parcels and their proposed land uses or zoning. Lastly, to thematic maps. Generally, these are data-driven maps showcasing attributes or analytical assessments of plan impacts or benefits. These maps use shading or patterns to represent a spatial measurement of elements like population density, emissions, energy use, or more. In this example here on the right, Urban Footprint displays a choropleth map of walk access to parks in Santa Monica. So before we continue, let's take a quick second to poll the audience and learn how often we practice hands-on map making. Do you yourself make maps today? All right, so based on those poll results, there are quite a few of us that don't make maps on a regular basis. We actually often hear from customers that they'd like to be making maps themselves more often, but they're frequently bogged down by data management or complex GIS tools that require more extensive technical training. There are two foundational functions in UrbanFootprint that are specially designed to help everyone access curated and pre-styled data to create beautiful maps. First, UrbanFootprint has something we call the base canvas, which is a parcel level land use map that's available for almost all US locations. Secondly, we have a library of hundreds of preloaded data layers you can add quickly to complement any base map. You'll see these data layers in action during our live workshop session later on, but next let's move on to the key elements of effective map design. So here's the structure for how I tend to think about the various pieces of a map that I'm working on in UrbanFootprint. First is the base map. So all other layers are overlaid on top of this particular layer. These base maps can be as simple as a basic landmass layer or contain a lot of built-in details like streets and landmarks. UrbanFootprint happens to come with a variety of out-of-the-box options for these. Next come context layers. So these typically aren't the main focus of the map, but help provide additional orientation to the viewer as to where this map is situated in the world. Common examples include water bodies and open spaces that most people would be familiar with as landmarks. For planners who are more familiar with built environment patterns, these layers could include the street grid or building footprints. Next, the real subject of your map are what I call feature layers. So typically you'd only have one or two of these in any given map that you're creating. For example, in the case of a site plan, the feature layer could be the parcelization showing proposed land use changes. In a circulation map, the feature layer would be the street or the transit network itself. These layers typically have the most distinctive symbology to really stand out from the base map and other layers. Lastly, annotation layers help provide additional reference for the primary focus of the map. For example, if my map compares characteristics between neighborhoods, I would have an annotation layer that shows boundaries and labels for those neighborhoods. All right, so let's dig into some of the details around choosing a base map. Here are some of the options available in UrbanFootprint. Some of our base maps have a lot of detail already built in, like the first two that you see here. They'll feel pretty similar to the type of map you'd see in Google Maps and are great if you're just looking to add a single layer or two to make a quick map. But because many of the context details are baked into the base map directly, you don't have quite as much control for how they're styled or ordered relative to other layers. These satellite imagery base maps can be helpful if you need to show information in close relationship to the physical conditions seen on the ground or do some ground truthing. And these last base maps include far fewer details, showing only the landmass or street grid with a very faint appearance. They're simpler by design with the expectation that you'll be adding many additional layers and will want more styling control over them. So, for example, you may end up adding some of these types of context layers. Think of these layers as information that allows someone familiar with a given geography to easily recognize it. Building footprints or the road network can showcase the underlying physical patterns of the built environment. For coastal cities like we see here, water is also an essential feature to highlight. In other geographies, having hillshade or contours may be important for showing where the built environment meets the natural. And sometimes we even like to suggest using the parcel outlines themselves as more of a contextual layer with a simple outline for styling. Not every map is going to require the context of all of these layers at once, depending on the topical focus and geography. I prefer to have more of an additive approach to working with these, starting with one or two and seeing if those do the trick in providing enough context. Using too many context layers could obscure the feature layer that you're actually trying to emphasize in your map. All right, so next let's take a look at styling considerations for feature layers. So remember, these are the layers that represent the primary message of your map. Your symbology approach will vary depending on the type of data your feature layer contains. So for polygon layers, we commonly apply a colored fill to the shapes that reflect the underlying data. For categorical data, like the land use data we see here on the left, each polygon receives a unique hue corresponding to the category that it represents. To showcase numeric data, like energy use data now on the right, we vary the lightness of the fill to show an ordered difference. These changes in fill are more commonly known in mapmaking as color progressions or ramps. Okay, so now we'll cover how to apply color to different types of ramps. First, let's talk about effective use of color ramps for qualitative or categorical data. So these ramps make use of variations in hue for discrete, unordered classes of nominal data. For example, race or ethnicity or land uses. Generally, there is similar lightness between the colors in your ramp, but if a particular class needs to be emphasized, it is possible to use a darker or more saturated color to highlight it. In the case of land use data, we may use light and dark pairs for subcategory differentiation, like low-rise residential versus mid or high-rise residential, like we see here in the bottom left. One thing to keep in mind is studies have shown we can only distinguish a maximum of about 7 colors easily. Next, sequential ramps are applied to ordered numerical data, such as floor area ratios or population density. These ramps fade from a dark shade of a chosen color to a very light or white tint of the same hue. These changes in lightness correspond to the data's progression. Lighter hues typically correspond to lower values and darker hues to higher values. Sequential schemes can use a single hue, like the red one we see here at the top, or be derived from multiple hues. This multi-hue example on the bottom goes from light yellow to dark blue, with green hues appearing for values in the middle of the progression. I think multi-hue classes are better when you actually want to be able to distinguish values easily across the entire range of a data distribution. The difference between high and low values is double encoded visually, so you're using both change in lightness and change in hue. Lastly, diverging ramps use a combination of 2 sequential schemes that diverge from a shared light color that represents a critical breakpoint in the middle. For example, you could use a diverging ramp to show deviation from an average midpoint, with values on the left showing below average and on the right showing above average. The darker the hue on each end, the further from the midpoint value it is. Another important thing to keep in mind when choosing color ramps is that color is perceived differently by everyone. Not only does color connotation vary across cultures, but 4.5% of people have color vision deficiencies, resulting in totally different registration of various colors. So even though these 2 particular ramps appear very similar, going from more reddish hues to greenish hues, to someone with red-green color blindness, these 2 maps may look more like this. You'll notice that the ends of the red-green ramp on the left look really similar to someone with red-green color blindness. They both go to kind of a darker brownish yellow hue. But the orange and teal ends of our ramp on the top right still appears 2 distinct hues on the bottom right, going from more of a yellowish brown to a gray color. Looking more closely at how this translates to our map, we can see that the 2 red parcels here in the middle look almost identical to their neighbors in the bottom left to someone with red-green color blindness. But in the orange-teal map, the 2 center parcels accurately maintain their distinction for those with or without vision deficiencies. All right, so next we'll cover how to effectively focus the intent of our map with annotation layers. Again, these are layers that help provide concrete reference to our map. If we're comparing characteristics between different parts of the city, we may choose administrative boundaries or neighborhood boundaries as our annotation layers, like we see here. We could also show a distance buffer if we're trying to understand accessibility thresholds. In this example, we display a half-mile buffer around transit stops. Or we could use a buffered area if we're trying to highlight a particular site of interest. So here we're showing just a general buffer around particular parcels in our project area. Okay, so now let's take a look at how to put all of these various pieces together in one map. So for me, the ability to change the transparency of a layer plays an important role in successfully emphasizing the main feature layers, while still providing good context and rich granularity to your map. So for this map, I've started by choosing a relatively minimal base map, displaying landmass with a simple fill and water shown in white. So next I'm going to add 2 layers for context. So I've used UrbanFootprint's base canvas parcels with a very faint outline and a road network layer shown with white strokes. Both of these are pretty lightweight in visual effect at around 10 to 20% opacity, but having them helps contextualize the general patterns of development in our area. So now comes our main feature layer. In this case, it's an analysis generated by UrbanFootprint showing transit access to employment. So I've used a green to blue sequential ramp, which represents greater access to jobs via transit in the darker colors. I've set it at about 80% opacity, so the context layers still show through, but the primary visual focus is on this layer. Lastly, I'm bringing in a relevant annotation layer. So because the subject of my map is about transit access, having a representation of the transit network itself can play an important role in how we're actually interpreting the primary data layer. Okay, so before we jump into the next portion of our webinar of actual map making demos, I'm going to hand things back over to Ben quickly to review some of the export options available in UrbanFootprint.
All right, great. Thanks, Stephen. So before Stephen jumps into a live map making demo, I'd like to highlight a few features related to map exporting and actually making use of your maps in your everyday planning tasks. For example, things like client or community stakeholder communication, proposals, presentations, reporting, and so forth. So UrbanFootprint has the ability to select scale. So you can create exports that are great for sketching out actual proposals or for whatever context you may need to showcase your map. UrbanFootprint has a quick export feature as well. This is really perfect for just creating a quick snapshot of what you see in the application. Very easy to use. We use this a lot actually if we're making a slideshow and we need to display a lot of assets really quickly. We also have a more thorough export option, which gives you more control. It does things like it allows you to set things like resolution and page size, things like that. This is very useful if you're trying to create assets for a report. Maybe you need to place it into layout tools, things like Microsoft Word or InDesign or Illustrator. So that's a quick overview of export. Looking at the chat, it's interesting. There was a lot of feedback on the importance of having maps that accommodate color blindness. So great to get that feedback and hear that there's interest in that. So next, before Stephen jumps into the demo, we'll do a quick survey. We'd like to pose another quick question for the audience today. To gauge our collective map-making skills, the question is about how long would it typically take you to generate the transit access to employment map that Stephen showed up there a few minutes ago, including actually getting the data, the source data required to make that map.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you for answering that question and for that quick overview, Ben, as well. So with that, let's actually get to making some maps. So during this demo session, we'll learn how to make 3 general types of maps and exhibits. First, on the left here, we'll share how to show making existing conditions maps and effectively display land use conditions with proper layer management and smart use of transparency. In the next demo, we'll walk through how to visualize proposed land use scenarios by highlighting changes to the built environment. We'll create a new scenario in UrbanFootprint and use the built form manager to actually update land use in that scenario. And then finally, we'll share how to map a plan impact analysis with UrbanFootprint. So in that example, we'll create a thematic choropleth map and cover best practices for color ramp selection and using annotation layers. So now let's go ahead and make our first map. I'm actually going to jump over to the UrbanFootprint application itself. So again, for this map, we'll focus on how to represent existing conditions in just a few minutes. So let's say that we're working in Burbank, California, and want to make a map to represent existing conditions for city resilience based on flood hazard areas. So as we start a project in UrbanFootprint, you can see it comes preloaded with our base canvas, which has detailed land use information for the parcels in our project area. For the purposes of this map, though, I'm not going to be using this particular layer, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off the visibility. Next, I'm actually going to switch to a more minimal base map so that we have a bit more control over the styling of various layers. This option here, minimal land dark, is a bit more of a blank slate. You can see we no longer show the road network that we saw in the other base map. And it still has features like rivers and water features shown in a darker black, with the main background being a dark gray. Okay, so now let's get started by adding in a couple of context layers. We can use the Add button here at the top left to open our layer manager, which reveals all of the available data layers that are accessible right away when you start a project in UrbanFootprint. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a road network layer. So I search for roads, and I'm going to add that to our project, and building footprints. And these are both national layers, so you could access them in the majority of projects that you want to start. So it's added these to my list, and I'll turn them on really quickly here so you can see what the the default symbology looks like. So roads, right away, we can see a little bit the default symbology. They have white strokes, and then for a lot of the local roads, and then you can see that it's symbolized highways and primary and secondary roads with more of these orange or yellow tones. So I'm actually going to change the symbology of these a bit. One technique I like to use when showcasing the road as more of a context layer is to actually just make them all the same color. In this case, I'm choosing a black stroke that's somewhat similar to the actual primary color of our base map. Again, this is because the roads in and of themselves are not meant to be the primary layer that I want to emphasize or highlight, but I still want to be able to read them somewhat from the base map because I want a good reading of the variation in the way that the road network is laid out for context. So I'm going to save the symbology there. And then the building footprints, you probably can't see right now. The default symbology is a lighter gray stroke, so I'll change it to something else quickly. So I just changed the stroke to this lime green just so you can see how robust this building footprints layer is that's available immediately in UrbanFootprint. But I'll actually change the styling to, again, have more of a neutral coloring relative to the base map. So I've changed the fill to a black again. Because as a context layer, I want it to be legible, and I want to be able to read it as a texture or a pattern on top of my base map, but it's, again, not the primary focus of my map. And so I've chosen this kind of neutral black tone, and I'll turn the opacity down just a little bit. Okay, so now that we've added our context layers, let's bring in, again, what I call a feature layer. In this case, I'm looking for some resilience layers that indicate various constraints on potential development that we can propose. So I'm going to search for a flood hazard layer that we have that's available from FEMA, and I'll add that to our project. And now you can see that we've added a new set of features on our map. In this case, they are symbolized categorically, showing different types of flood hazard zones. And one thing I want to conceptually showcase in this map around existing flood risk is that we can create things like a conceptual buffer that represents the fact that we're restricted from developing within a quarter mile of certain types of flood zones. So I'll quickly show you how that buffer gets created. So I'm going to add a filter to this layer and select several of those types of flood zones. And in UrbanFootprint, I can, I need to add the buffer. So I'm going to add what we mentioned as the quarter mile buffer around those selected layers and save it as an entirely new layer in our project. So UrbanFootprint's going to take a moment to create that new buffer. Great, so it just added it. And I'm going to clear out the filter selection on this layer. All right, so we've now added a buffer layer. And again, I will change the symbology a bit so you can see that. So the default symbology now shows the buffer that we created in this white outline. And I'll show that relative to the previous flood hazard layer, so you can kind of see the origin for these buffers and how it relates to that original flood hazard layer. So to symbolize for my existing conditions representation of flood hazard, I'm going to change the symbology of this buffer layer a little bit. So remember, conceptually, our topic is around flood hazard, so it would make pretty good sense to use some blue tones to represent this. So I added kind of a middle blue for the fill of that layer, and I'm going to add a brighter blue just to kind of further emphasize the outline of that layer. And then I'm going to drop the opacity a bit. So now we can see those buffers shown in a blue fill. And one thing to note in UrbanFootprint is that the order of the layers here on the left-hand side dictates the layer and how, or the order and how our layers get represented on the map. So I can quickly change around the layering of these to put the new buffer layer beneath our context layers of building footprints and roads. And what this now allows us to see is actually the existing conditions of where built up areas already overlap in our flood hazard layer. So I could go ahead and export this and use it as part of a presentation or a proposal or a report. We could do the same thing with other kinds of layers that exist in UrbanFootprint that show conditions like fire hazard severity. So here we can quickly see how our buildings and roads that showcase the existing built environment already overlap fire hazard areas. I won't go into further details today on the other dozens of environmental layers that are available to further examine development constraints like core habitat connectivity areas, protected watersheds, and more. But those are all available in our layer manager as well. All right, so let's take a look at making our second map. So this next one, we will learn how to represent a future or proposed land use scenario. So for this exhibit, we're going to jump back to our application and start a project in Santa Monica. So again, you'll see that the base canvas automatically pops up with parcel level land use information for our area in Santa Monica. Since here our goal is to highlight the land use changes from one scenario to the next, I'm going to copy the current base scenario to create a new scenario where we'll be updating the parcels with our proposal. So you can see now UrbanFootprint has generated another scenario that comes with its own parcel canvas. From this, I can actually go in and start to select the parcels that I want to change to a new land use type. So for our project, I'm going to focus on selecting some parcels along a particular commercial corridor. So I'm using a polygon selection tool here while I'm on this layer. If I turn the opacity down a bit, you can now see that the parcels I've selected from my canvas are highlighted in blue here. And I can go into build mode for this particular layer and choose a different land use type. In this case, I'm going to use a different building type to apply to this selection of parcels. So for our example, I'll go in and I'm going to search for an option that is more aligned with kind of mid-rise mixed-use buildings here. So I've got mid-rise mixed-use as an available building type. And you'll notice that as we select that particular building type, UrbanFootprint now displays building characteristics like building use mix, floor area ratio, et cetera. And it also shows a program for how this particular change will impact the area in terms of population, employment, dwelling units, et cetera. So I'm going to go ahead and paint those particular layers. And now you can see on our map, again, if I turn up the opacity a bit, that the selected parcels have now changed to that new land use type, or built form type, excuse me. I'm going to go ahead and change just a couple more of them, just for illustrative purposes to, let's say, a high-rise mixed-use type, just as an example. So now those parcels are given an even darker red in our categorical ramp. Okay, so now that we've kind of conceptually built out the proposal that we're planning for this scenario, I'm going to actually work on some symbology to actually highlight the land use changes here. So I will up the opacity of my scenario canvas. UrbanFootprint has this nifty feature, an option to essentially show only the parcels that we've actually painted or built on in our proposal. So if I select that, you'll see that we've actually removed the visibility of all the parcels that we haven't made any changes to, but just are now showing for that particular layer the proposed new built form types. And I'm going to bring back in the base canvas so we can see the new proposal relative to the existing conditions. So on the base canvas, I like to actually drop the opacity a bit, somewhere around 30 or 40%, so that we can still actually get a good reading of the general patterns of built form types and land uses across our site. But the visual emphasis, again, is on our scenarios proposed land use changes. So now that we demonstrated a proposed change in our project area, a natural next step would be to analyze the potential impacts and benefits of a new scenario. So going back to our overview, our third map will be about representing a thematic layer that's generated from UrbanFootprint's built-in analysis modules. So I'm going to jump to a project in Boise now. So for today's example, let's try out building out a transit access map here. Let's see, make sure I get set up properly. There we go. Switch to a different base map. Okay, so here's a project I've already started where I pre-run the transit access module. For future reference, all you have to do to run the module is simply click the play button on any of our built-in analysis modules and wait for that analysis to finish running in a matter of minutes. Let's take a look at some of the output layers that our transit access module in particular provides. So once a module finishes running, it will add these layers to your project as well. And you can actually run the module for any scenario that you create to understand the differences. So the default symbology for the layer that I have selected, in this case, transit access to destinations, should look pretty familiar. Right now we have it set to representing the access time to the nearest hospital. So we're seeing the layer represented as a choropleth layer with the data represented using a sequential ramp. So in this case, the single hue of blue going from light to dark shows where when it's lighter blue, those are closer parcels or parcels that are fewer minutes in transit travel time to the nearest hospital, excuse me. Whereas the darker blues are further from the nearest hospital and take more time on transit to access. So you can kind of see that pattern and how it's distributed across Boise in our project area. So this particular layer, let's play around with a few color ramp options to show how different choices in our color ramp allow us to tell slightly different nuanced stories with our data. So again, the default symbology in this case uses a single hue sequential ramp, but I want to showcase the real power, I think, of a multi-hue ramp. So I'm going to show you this light yellow to darker blue ramp. What I think the value of this ramp shows is that you're really seeing the variation across your data distribution more clearly, because now we're not only changing from light to dark in one color, we're changing from light in color A, in this case, a kind of a yellowish green, to a dark blue. And so you're really seeing the emphasis of the change across our data distribution a bit more clearly. I'll show you the difference one more time again. So there's a little bit less contrast from low to high, whereas here we're double encoding the visual to use both lightness and color change to make our point. So now let's imagine that we're trying to highlight a particular policy around providing a minimum access time of 40 minutes to a hospital by transit. So kind of in this imaginary scenario, I think this is where using a diverging ramp could make more sense, because we've set 40 minutes as our minimum threshold of access that we want to provide as a city to our residents. So now I've chosen the orange to teal ramp that we were looking at earlier with color accessibility considerations. And what you can really start to see is that the two ends of our data distribution get more intensely highlighted. So areas with really good access get one color, and areas with really poor access get another color. And the kind of lighter middle tones create this sort of threshold at the midpoint of our data distribution that we're trying to highlight. One thing I am going to do is actually flip the direction of this map. So conceptually, we're using a color that has more positive connotations, in this case, our teal color, to showcase the better access, and the kind of orangey color, which has more negative connotations for the areas with worse access. One thing I will quickly highlight is that you can actually change the bounds and customize the values for our classification bounds directly. I'm only going to change one of them just to demonstrate, but I just changed the kind of upper bound and lower bounds of one set of classes to be 40. In this case, this is that midpoint that we were talking about, where we're trying to kind of draw a conclusion around areas that have access above or below a certain threshold of 40 minutes. Okay, so now we've got a pretty good representation of transit access to hospitals. And I want to show as one last step for this map, actually bringing in what I call, again, a few annotation layers. I think there's a quick question in the webinar chat. These layers are, this data is showing access in minutes using the transit network specifically. We do have separate analyses that allow you to take a look at walk times as another example. Okay, so I'm going to add in a few context layers to kind of better understand or correlate to the actual transit network and its shape itself. So I'm going to bring in our transit lines and our transit stops. Again, these are national layers that you could bring in from any location. And I'll turn on the visibility of those so you can take a quick look. I'm going to quickly turn off our transit access to destinations, just so we can see the shape of our transit lines and stops layers as they come in default symbology. There's a question in chat. I actually also have a layer already created that showcases the hospitals. This was generated from our base canvas, and I just filtered out for layers that are only designated as hospitals, so we can also show that relative to our data layer. So I'm going to change the symbology for these really quickly. It looks like in Boise, our network is mainly made up of bus routes. I'm going to use, again, more of a neutral color, in this case, black again, to kind of showcase the network without necessarily having to indicate all the nuances of the different route types, because I'm not really interested in that particular aspect of the transit network story. So I'm going to choose a black stroke to represent the lines, and I'm actually going to make our stops a little bit smaller in radius, again, because these aren't really the primary topical focus of the map as a layer, but I do want them there for, kind of added texture to what our map is showcasing. So I added just a white fill, I changed the radius, and I brought the stroke down just a tad. So let's bring back in our original transit access layer, and we can see how all of these are starting to work together. I have my annotation layer set at around 90%, and I'm actually going to drop the opacity of our data layer to somewhere around 60 or 70%, so that the annotation layers at least pop relative to that data layer. So at 60 or 70% opacity, we can still get a decent reading of the general data patterns in our layers data distribution. So we can still see the light to dark teal areas and the light to orange areas. So we still have a good reading, but you can see that our transit network now has a stronger emphasis relative to that layer compared to when we had this sitting at 80 or 90% opacity. So the reason that I think these are valuable as annotation layers for this particular map is that we can now start to draw a correlation between the corridors which run down different parts of our city, and we could ask ourselves certain policy or access questions, like why one corridor has stronger access as you go further south out from the city center, and a different corridor, the access drops off more quickly. And we can see both the data relationship and how that relates to the actual physical structuring of that network. And we also might start to ask ourselves different policy or land use questions around how we can change access for areas that have worse access shown in the orange here. So great, so now that we've got a thematic map that indicates areas of good and poor access to hospitals, we put this together in just a few minutes. So that kind of concludes the demo portion of our presentation, and I'm going to hand things back over to Ben, who will facilitate a bit of Q&A with our remaining time.
All right, great. Thanks, Stephen. And thanks again, everyone, for your time today. We hope you found today's webinar helpful and you took away some actionable tips to start designing more effective maps. So before we kick off our live Q&A session, so a number of questions coming through the chat today, so we'll get to that in a moment. Before we do that though, we want to throw up a quick poll question. If you're not yet using UrbanFootprint, we invite you to sign up for a custom demo with our team to learn more. So if you'd like a demo, please let us know. Just if you'd like to sign up, simply click the yes button on the poll here and we'll be in touch to schedule a call. Just a little bit of information about that. We'll plan to spend some time learning about your map making challenges during that call and walk you through some examples of how UrbanFootprint may be able to help with your particular use case.
Well, great. So as people are responding here, I think we have time to take some of the questions that have been coming in. And I see a lot of questions about, can people bring their own data into UrbanFootprint? Do they have to work with us? Is there something in the app that just facilitates, adding your own data? Can you talk a little bit about that, Ben?
Sure. Yeah. So a number of questions came in about that. That's a great question. One thing, UrbanFootprint is great with both importing and exporting information. We talked a little bit about the export capability. I know there were some questions about the format support. So you can easily export your maps as things like shapefiles. We also support just raw CSV and actually things like SVG for vector output if you need to get your layers into other tools like Adobe Illustrator and so forth. And we also have some things in the roadmap. If you're interested in particular formats, let us know over the chat here, things like GeoPackage and other open formats for geodatabases we have in our roadmap. I know there's some interest in that, so we will support it here shortly. And then the other question sort of around importing. So the maps we showed today, are really powerful. They come out of the box and, you just have a lot of ready to use sophistication, both with the base maps and then all of the layers, the data layers, as well as the analysis layers, which we covered a bit. But you can also obviously bring in your own shapefile, so you can easily import and lay kind of any map that you've created outside of UrbanFootprint as a zip shapefile and just import it. And that gives you a ton of flexibility because you can mix and match your own custom maps with all of the sophistication that UrbanFootprint provides out of the box as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. I have a question for Stephen here. How do you end up choosing colors, or what are your recommendations for choosing colors for whether it's categorical or in a color ramp? You see in UrbanFootprint, there's some pre-built palettes. Looking at things you see out in media, there's a lot of purple going on right now. So is this just sort of an aesthetic, or is there method to the madness?
Yeah, a lot of it is relatively subjective. I mean, as you mentioned, there are certain trends. Like, for example, I'll often take a look at the types of maps that the team at the New York Times puts out. They put out some really beautiful, but also really well styled and effective visual communication in their mappings. For example, the teal to more orange map, that particular type of ramp I've seen pretty frequently in a lot of New York Times type of maps. When it comes to color choice for some of the categorical ramps, again, one of the great things in Urban Footprint is that we already have your land use parcel data mapped to a pretty good existing default symbology for those categories. I would say that one good practice is to start with categorical colors that are on the lighter end of the spectrum. I think there's a tendency to want to use rich, saturated colors to start with. But oftentimes, if you have a lot of different colors, using really oversaturated colors can, you'll start off with maybe a more visually confusing map because there's just a lot of intensity in those colors. And so I think one practice I try to embody is starting with colors on the lighter end or paler end, and then adding in visual emphasis depending on what the topic of my map is through darker or more saturated colors.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question here. You showed us how to make a transit accessibility map. What other maps can be generated out of the box using some of the analytics in Urban Footprint?
Yeah, I'll speak to a few and maybe get a little bit of support from the team there. I can showcase again the analysis modules that we have here. So the quick overview is that we can show a few outputs that relate to the changes in land consumption across the various land uses in our project area. We can also look at energy use, which has outputs related to residential energy use by different energy types or sources, as well as commercial energy use and total energy use in your city. Similarly, we have water usage rates. And again, those are broken down into different categories like commercial water use rates versus residential water use rates. Walk accessibility, you're going to see a somewhat similar feature set compared to the transit accessibility that we saw. And I didn't get to cover this in the demo, but we can see that we also have transit access as it relates to employment, as it relates to the distribution of households in our area. Transit access to park acreage is one we like to show a lot, and then general transit access to how our population is distributed. We have a transportation module and emissions module that show things under those topics, as well as household cost. And then the risk and resilience layer, that will have topically similar layers to what we saw in our first demo, where we're looking at how changes in land use relate to different types of potential hazards, such as sea level rise or flood risk or fire risk.
And I'll interject something real quick just to give people a sense for the scale of the data. The actual layers themselves, Stephen just covered a lot of the analysis capabilities, but the base map that we have covers about 120 million parcels throughout the entire United States. And there's actually over 1,000 data sets that are ready to use out of the box for anyone to start pick up and use.
Okay, so kind of building off of that, we've had a couple of questions around, what parts of the country are there data? Is it only in the most populated areas? Do we have coverage in rural? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, so we have data that covers the entire United States. We're obviously focused on urban areas, but we have data that spans, the vast majority of any community, really. And if you have specific questions, I mean, what you should do is reach out and get in touch. We can kind of custom tailor a demo to look at the community that you're trying to specifically address. But we really run the gamut from smaller communities. We have customers that are in small communities all the way up to large cities in the United States. So we kind of cover the bases of the entire country.
That's great. Thank you, Ben. Another question here. Kind of where do we get the data that comes standard in Urban Footprint?
Yeah, so we have a team here that's dedicated to acquiring data, and there's a lot of work in that. So we have to get the data, we have to normalize it, clean it up, and really curate it so that it's obviously very easy to use in the application and of high quality. So we have data from different sources. Some of it we commercially license, and then we go out and we get data that's also in the public sphere. So for example, we'll get data from different national federal agencies like NOAA, for example. We'll get census data, which soon you'll be able to look at longitudinally over time from 2010 to the 2020 census, things like that. And then we also get data from local communities at the state level. For example, we've got a ton of really amazing data sets for California, including things like fire risk and different sea level rise data sets. So there's a lot of very interesting state level data as well. And we're bringing in new data sets every day. So if there's something specifically that you're looking for, we're doing this at scale. And so we can facilitate that if you have specific use cases. And that's why we really encourage you to kind of get in touch with us. We can kind of demo what we have and try to really build maps and do analysis for your specific use cases and see what data sets you need. But we're very confident that we have just incredible data. We really think we're very proud of it. And it gets better every day. So that's really what we're building out and providing for our customers.
Well, very good. I just want to touch on one of the poll questions here that we did. It had to do with how long it would take to make the map that we showed you. I think one of the, hopefully one of the things you're taking away from this is that using UrbanFootprint, you can do this type of cartography probably a lot quicker than you could using standard GIS. And if you're not a GIS expert to begin with, you now have a tool to do that. So I think that if you want to learn more, I'd encourage you to reach back out to us and arrange a time to talk about your specific challenges.
Great. Well, thanks again, everyone, for your time today. And we hope to see you on the next webinar. Before we do that, let's do one quick poll though for folks who are still on. We want to do more of these webinars in the future and get into more details and really kind of address what you're looking for in terms of information and help. So our poll is around what maps or design topics would you like to see in future webinars? So please let us know there, and we will try to do something again, a series of future webinars around what you're interested in learning about.
Okay, so with that said, on behalf of Jason, Ben, Stephen, and myself, I'd like to thank everyone for spending the hour with us. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type things into chat before we sign off of the webinar, and we will be in touch very shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.